The producers of Wild About Wheels present this special home video program. This is the story of an American legend, a tall Texan with a knack for getting things done who pushed aside the impossible and made incredible automobiles that have few, if any, equals in the world of high performance. His name has become synonymous with cars that accelerate, corner, and stop with tremendous ability. This is the story of Carroll Shelby, and coming up on this program, you'll hear him talk about his spectacular career in 2 exclusive interviews held at his corporate headquarters in Southern California. You'll hear about the birth of the Cobra and the Shelby Mustangs. You'll see rare racing footage of his world champion 1965 Daytona Coupe, the Shelby team's dramatic victory at the 24 Hours of Le Mans in 1967, plus interviews with Dan Gurney, Rick Kopech of the Shelby American Automobile Club, and we'll take you to Palm Springs, California for the world-famous historic races to see vintage Shelby automobiles running flat out. You'll hear Carroll Shelby talk about his involvement with the new generation of performance cars from Chrysler, including the sensational Viper. You'll see never-before-seen footage of the Viper being built at its amazing production facility at Chrysler. And we'll show you the latest version of the Viper, the awesome Viper GTS, a car that brings the Cobra Daytona Coupe into the 90s. We'll take you to the races to see the Shelby Can-Am in action, the sports racer created by Carroll Shelby to help American drivers work their way into Indy cars and Formula One. And we'll take a look at the worldwide Cobra replica phenomenon that has brought an entirely new generation of car lovers into the 427 Cobra experience. I'm your host, Bill Stevens, and to begin, let's go back to the early days of sports car racing, when the center of the sports car universe was unquestionably Europe. Sports car racing has roots that go back to the earliest days of the 20th century. It was Europe that served as the birthplace for road racing, which in many cases was indeed held on public roads. Mercedes, Peugeot, and Fiat were only 3 of many European builders who understood how cars that carried exciting racing credentials could further popularize these somewhat recent inventions and put everyone on wheels. Meanwhile, in America, the automobile was more an instrument of transportation than competition. The road racing bug had yet to really sink into the automotive mindset of Americans. Races like the Indianapolis 500 and a host of small track events centered largely on a kind of racing that was irrelevant to production-based sports car racing, which was firmly established in Europe. Throughout the 40s and 50s, great European cars and drivers held a stranglehold on the sports car and Grand Prix racing headlines. Fangio, Moss, Nuvolari, and Ascari were winning the great races at the Nürburgring, Monaco, and Silverstone. The great factory teams of Auto Union and Mercedes-Benz, Ferrari and Maserati were the newsmakers in the worlds of road racing and sports car racing. In 1953, the sports car tide was beginning to turn in America, with Chevy's introduction of the Corvette and Ford's production of the 2-seat Thunderbird. Americans were on the verge of gaining some real appreciation for light, well-balanced cars that could handle much better than the overweight, softly sprung, full-sized cars that America had grown accustomed to. It was not long after the Corvette was up and running that sports car builders began to modify them for road racing. The Corvette's V8 engine gave it plenty of power, but it still had a long way to go to match the kind of all-around performance that European sports cars had long mastered. And so, the Corvette's racing successes occurred not in the great world-class races against formidable GT competition, but in the national production class racing, where they were strong favorites. But America's lackluster racing image internationally was about to take an abrupt upswing. After winning the 24 Hours of Le Mans in 1959 in an Aston Martin DBR1, co-driven by Englishman Roy Salvadori, Carroll Shelby, the ex-chicken farmer turned race car driver, learned he had a bad heart, ending his professional driving career. Born in Leesburg, Texas in 1923, after an acclaimed career, albeit a short one, driving race cars, including national championships and even Formula One experience, Shelby took what he had learned and began formulating his plans to build a sports car that would combine European handling with American horsepower. In the first of 2 interviews we conducted with Shelby, he spoke of the early stages of his plans.
The reason I wanted to go to Europe was because I wanted to learn how Ferrari, Maserati, Aston Martin, all those teams built their cars, and ran little automobile companies, and that was a double reason for me not only to drive race cars, but I wanted to learn how those little companies work. And I found that out, and when I quit in 1960, I started building the Cobra. And everybody's heard that story, I guess. I borrowed an engine from Ford. I got AC to build a chassis to take the V8 engine. Everybody thought that we just took an AC chassis, but it was much more complicated than that. We had to change the chassis. Although the chassis was the same type of design as the Chigiro chassis from many years before that, it was a lot heftier and beefier to take the 400 horsepower that we were putting in it versus the 120 for the little AC Bristol engine.
The very first Cobras were undoubtedly crude but frighteningly fast. Early Cobras had 260 cubic inch Ford V8s in them, and Shelby knew he had a hot item. With only 1 car built, he immediately offered it to the national automotive magazines to test. When one magazine was done with it, it would get a new paint job of a different color to give the appearance that plenty of Cobras were being built. The magazines were unanimously praiseworthy of this sawed-off shotgun on wheels. It could out-accelerate Chevy's fastest Corvette and could match the much sleeker Stingray's top speed. The Cobra was the car that everyone was buzzing about. They had no side windows, a leaky top, hardly any ventilation, and they rode like a buckboard. But if you wanted to dust anything on the road, your choice was clear. Later on, Shelby's Cobras got 289 cubic inch Ford V8s, which made them even faster. But it was never Shelby's plan to put a Cobra in every driveway. He had a clear-cut idea, and it was many years ahead of its time.
I knew what I wanted to build. I knew that you couldn't compromise it. And I was shooting for a little niche market. Now niches are all over the place. There's a lot of niche markets, but I didn't want to build but about 500 cars a year to begin with.
In truth, Shelby would have been just as happy building only 100 of his 289 Cobras, the number necessary to qualify the cars for international GT competition. Shelby's grand plan was to win the World Championship for GT cars, a title that Ferrari had won with predictable certainty season upon season. But before the Cobras would be ready for such a daunting task, they would have to undergo extensive race preparation and survive a somewhat lengthy period of growing pains as they entered the punishing arena of big-time sports car racing. Many of the Cobra's first racing outings ended in disappointment, caused by mechanical breakage somewhere on the car. No one, however, who drove a competition Cobra ever complained about a lack of power. Ford was marketing the Cobra as a head-to-head rival of the Corvette, and Shelby knew that competing in the showrooms against a comfortable, modern GT car like the Corvette would be a lot easier once the primarily primitive Cobra began taking some checkered flags. With Ford entering a gung-ho performance campaign called Total Performance, the Cobra and Carroll Shelby were squarely in the spotlight.
Well, it's often been said that timing is everything.
Rick Kopek is the president of the Shelby American Automobile Club, a worldwide organization which performs exhaustive research and compiles vast historical records of all Shelby-built automobiles. Rick Sharon, Connecticut Club headquarters is an infinite compilation of Shelby memorabilia, and Rick is one of the foremost authorities on his close friend Carroll Shelby. He recounts the initial days of the Shelby-Ford collaboration.
He went to Ford right when Ford was on the edge of their Total Performance project. They wanted to be known in NASCAR, in IndyCar, in sports cars, and in drag racing. And Shelby was the sports car connection. He came to them with an idea to put one of their engines in a sports car. They were warm, they weren't red hot, they were lukewarm, and Shelby was enough of a promoter to get them involved and to keep them involved. And his ideas of where he wanted to go happened to coincide with where Ford wanted to go, and Ford was happy to let him do the driving to get him there.
The 1963 racing season, at least in America, had given the Shelby American gang some solid evidence that things were going to come their way after all. National championships in the SCCA and the United States Road Racing Championship Series in 1963 spelled the end of the Corvette's production racing dominance. And in the National and American Hot Rod Associations, Cobras were busting record after record. In the GT Wars, however, 1963 was no more than a learning experience. And one of the lessons learned was that in order to take a serious shot at Ferrari's championship turf, the Cobra would need a smoother set of clothes.
We wanted to go international racing, and the 0289 Cobra was about as aerodynamic as a shoebox. So we got together. Pete Brock, Phil Remington, Ken Miles was very instrumental in it. Pete Brock came up with a sketch, and we came up with a car that went from 150 miles an hour with 400 horsepower to 200 miles an hour. And we developed that all in about 4, 5, or 6 months.
And thus, the Cobra Daytona Coupe became a reality. Dan Gurney, one of the world's greatest race drivers, was one of many driving stars who raced for Shelby. Gurney's career was as remarkable as it was successful. His winning record in a wide assortment of race cars, from NASCAR stockers to GT cars to Formula One, clearly establishes him as one of history's most prominent superstars. Still a close friend to Shelby, we visited Dan at his offices located in Santa Ana, California, home of All American Racers, the IMSA GTP operation, which is under his command. We asked him to talk about his remembrances of the Cobra and to share his reflections on Carroll Shelby, the man.
The Cobra Roadster was the one that I had the most experience with, although Pete Brock, a young design engineer who was also very creative, got very brave and went out and designed a coupe and did a terrific job on that. And that still it still looks good and it still performs well even today. But the origins, the Southern California origins, which include what was the hot rod phenomena from the dry lakes and the illegal racing on the streets in post-war California, and also later on the beginnings of drag racing, which still goes today. That was the progenitor, or that's where the Cobra really came from, and it was a hot-rodded Ford engine and this AC Cobra chassis. The marriage of that plus the Rem and the rest of the engineers that put it all together, it was an interesting and unique automobile that was able to get the job done. Carroll is an amazing, he's, as a politician, I think that that's maybe his greatest strength, although, and he's a visionary, but he was a very good, he won a lot of races in the Sports Car Club of America areas. He drove Ferraris, he was very fast, he could drive right in the same leagues with Phil Hill and Hanskin and those that were the top ones, and Carroll won championships, and he was a very racy guy. But he was a marketing man par excellence, and he could essentially talk the shirt off your back and you'd love every moment of it. But being a visionary, wanting to do something with Ford's backing and bring along a car that would somehow beat Chevrolet, and I don't think he thought about beating Ferrari at the time, but through a lot of people, Phil, not the least of which is Phil Remington, who is here with All American Racers to this day, who helped him knit the whole picture together, and a lot of us enthusiast drivers, why we had a group of Yanks that just had the time of our lives, and Carroll orchestrated the whole thing with his great abilities, and again, who could ask for better memories?
There would be many glorious and inglorious memories of the 1964 season, as the Daytona Coupes, so named because of their debut in the 1964 Daytona Continental, began to amass top finishes in a string of GT events, both in America and overseas. Its first GT class victory would come at Sebring that year. And as the season wore on, the Cobra was in position to pull off a major upset, a world championship in its rookie season. But it was not to be. With 3 events remaining on the schedule, the Cobras would have to score top finishes in all of them to nail down the championship. Enzo Ferrari, who had long and loyal ties to the FIA, was not going to take any chances.
We should have won the world championship in 1964 with it. But old man Ferrari, being a rascal that he was, got the last world championship event at Monza canceled. So we had beat him 5 straight races up till then, and he saw the handwriting on the wall, and he got it changed. But we nailed him next year, so it doesn't make any difference.
1965, the year that gave America its first and only World Manufacturers Championship. The Guardsman Blue Daytona Coupes were front-page news. America had gained new respect in the racing world, and Carroll Shelby had made good on his promise in 1964 when he said, "Next year, Ferrari's ass is mine." As the Cobras were rolling into the winner's circle all over the world, back home, Ford was busy developing a car that was to dramatically change the direction of the automobile's compass heading almost overnight. It was a car that would capture the affections of a new, younger generation of car buyers. And even Ford may have been a bit surprised as to how quickly and convincingly its new 4-seat sporty car took off. The Ford Mustang hit the streets at just the right moment to resonate with the country's accent on youth. Lee Iacocca was the man who was pushing the buttons at Ford in 1965. And although the Mustang could be ordered with any number of performance-oriented options, Iacocca knew that the Mustang needed real racetrack credentials to earn some genuine marketing topspin. Iacocca picked up the phone and called California.
Shelby Mustang came along because Iacocca called me in. These guys that I told you that were so jealous of Shelby went to Sport Car Club of America and says, "We're going to make the Mustang a sport car." And I didn't know about this till about a month later. They'd gone to John Bishop and told him that they were going to make it a sport car, and he says, "Well, it's not a sport car. It's a 4-door car that a 4-seat car. It's not a sport car." Finally, when they told Iacocca they couldn't make it a sport car, he called me and said, "Can you make a sport car?" So I called my guys together, the people that I worked with at Ford, and the people that the Al Dowds and the Phil Remingtons, and said, "Can we make this a sport car?" And then I called, we decided we could, and then I called John Bishop and said, "John, what does it take to make the Mustang a sport car instead of saying, we're going to make this a sport car?" And he says, "Oh, hell, Shelby," says, "that's pretty simple." Said, "Take the back seat out and change the suspension around so that it handles better and it's not a little old mushy 6-cylinder." They'd start putting the V8s in them then. And so I got them to build a high-performance 289 V8. We took the suspension and changed it. We put a large rear end in it with a limited slip, took the rear seat out, and went out and beat the hell out of the Corvettes with it.
The car which was created from Shelby's total performance conversion was the Shelby GT350. The 350 designation, as legend has it, was decided on one day when the Shelby crew was brainstorming on possible names for the car, and the boss asked someone how many feet it was from the office they were in at Shelby's Los Angeles facility to the assembly shop. The answer? 350 feet. The GT350 was an immediate racetrack thoroughbred, nailing down the SCCA's B Production Championship in its debut season of 1965. It would win it again in 66 and 67. The reworked 289 Ford V8 made 306 horsepower in street trim, and in the special racing version of the GT350, dubbed the R model, of which very few were built, horsepower was well over 300. And while the Cobra was somewhat of a tough sell for Ford dealers due to its comparative price with the much more cushy Corvette, the GT350 was a bit easier to market in 1965. Just over 500 GT350s were built in '65. And Rick Kopech, who owns an original 65 R model, talked about why the GT350 had more showroom appeal than its AC-based predecessor.
If there was a negative with the Cobra, it was that the Ford dealers found it very hard to associate that car with the other cars on their showroom floor, whereas a Corvette was very clearly a Chevrolet. It shared more than just the engine and the hubcaps. The Cobra didn't. The Cobra had a Ford engine, but most people never saw that. They just saw this English rounded sports car, two-seater, aluminum, and it was hard for them to rationalize that this was a Ford. That was one of the big problems for the dealers. But when Shelby came out with his version of the Mustang, of course that was much easier. It was obviously a Mustang. And yet there was something about the car that if you saw one coming at you down the road or in a parking lot, there was just something about the silhouette of that car that you knew it was more than just a Mustang. I think the tires filling up the wheel wells, just the aggressive stance that the car had, the stripes, the hood scoop, the hood pins, the things that you were used to seeing on a real race car, and at that time you didn't see them on street cars.
This car is probably the most notorious of any automobile associated with the name Shelby, and it may be the most notorious, period. The 427 Cobra. A car which was built when Shelby got wind that Chevrolet was planning to race a big block version of its Corvette, and that Ferrari was working on a new prototype car, which they hoped to qualify for the GT category. So by late 1965, Shelby's resourceful gang of fabricators and hot rodders constructed a now wider and more aggressive Cobra with a new independent coil spring suspension front and rear. And it was powered by the 427 cubic inch NASCAR side oiler Ford V8. The rest, as they say, is history. Few people were prepared for the 427 Cobra's performance. 0 to 60 in 4 seconds flat. 0 to 100 to 0 in under 14 on street tires, and a top speed of over 160. The Cobra had a reputation that quickly and firmly established it as the world's fastest production car. Since Shelby was unable to build 100 of the 427 Cobras in time to qualify for international racing, most that were raced were campaigned by privateers. It didn't take long for the 427 Cobra to take decisive possession of the National A Production Championship for the remainder of the decade, and once again in the early 70s. As for the big block lightweight Corvette that Chevy was working on,
they went out of the business when they saw us building the 427 Cobras, so I was sorry to see that, because it would have been a lot of fun to race, you know, to race them.
the 427 Cobra is without question one of the most sought-after automobiles ever built. Its legend and lore have, if anything, increased with time. And although it never had the chance to race internationally as a GT race car, there can be no dispute that it is still a most formidable performance car some 30 years after its birth. By 1966, Shelby's overwhelming success as the builder of race-proven performance cars was at its peak. Hertz Rent-A-Car jumped on the Shelby bandwagon by having 1,000 GT350s built to offer to its rental customers. They all carried the GT350H designation, and more than a few were rented on Friday and then taken to the racetrack to pick up a trophy or two before being returned on Monday. Their tongue-in-cheek nickname, Rent-A-Racer, has survived until this day. Also in 1966, Carroll Shelby was brought squarely into Ford's immediate plans to win the 24 Hours of Le Mans with its Ford GT. Shelby was instrumental in fine-tuning the Ford GT to accomplish its mission, and Dan Gurney would play a pivotal role in the Ford GT saga, not only as a development driver for Shelby American, but in one of his most memorable victories, the 1967 24 Hours of Le Mans. Ford won that great race in 1966, sweeping the first 3 places with Shelby-prepared GT40s finishing 1 and 2. In 1967, the Ford driving team consisted of such driving greats as A.J. Foyt, Mario Andretti, and Dan Gurney, who would be making his final trip to Le Mans as a driver. Gurney explains the clever strategy that spelled one of his most impressive victories.
My previous experience, where I had been there 6 times and had almost always been beaten by another older fellow, Briggs Cunningham, who wasn't really well known as a race driver, but knew how to approach that race. I took a lot of hints from Briggs and applied that to my effort there in '67 and convinced AJ that our philosophy should be, it's not a race, it's an endurance contest. Well, we did, regardless of what Ford said to us, and I don't think Ford realized. We were voted the least likely to succeed, I'm sure. And of course, by applying what was Briggs's philosophy, next thing you know, we had a tremendous lead, and we won the race and set new records and won the index of performance, which had to do with mileage as well. I mean, we just smoked the dickens out of everybody, and it was a great day.
The Shelby legend was established. It was soon apparent, however, that there was a change taking place in the world of performance. By 1968, the Cobra was out of production. The Shelby Mustangs were built with Ford's increasing emphasis on luxury and de-emphasis on neck-snapping performance. The GT350s and the GT500s, which had been introduced in 1967, were evolving away from the Shelby philosophy. Carroll Shelby would devote his energies to a Trans Am team in the late 60s. But soon, his partnership with Ford and his commitment to building fierce automobiles with style and power would wind down altogether.
It ended about 1970 because performance went away. The Mustang was getting too heavy. You had to fool with environmental problems, emissions, and so forth, that we had to clean the environment up, but there was nothing to do. There weren't any interesting cars you could build, so I went to Africa for 10 years. I wanted to see Africa before it was gone, and I'm glad that I went then, because it'll be impossible to do in the 90s in Africa what I did in the 70s, late 60s and 70s, and that's see Africa as Africa was.
But the Shelby story of performance was far from over. Shelby's old friend Lee Iacocca would contact him shortly after he returned from Africa and ask Shelby to come aboard at Chrysler, where Iacocca was now chairman. Shelby agreed, and through the mid-'80s, he headed up a performance department that turned out a new generation of high-performance automobiles that gave Chrysler an exciting new image. Cars like the Dodge GLH and GLHS, Shelby Lancer, Shelby CSX, and Shelby Dakota pickup were vehicles that provided big-dollar performance for low prices. And what about Carroll Shelby today? His association with Chrysler continues, and after a heart transplant in 1990, he's returned to the kind of hectic pace that has marked his great career. Along with a Goodyear tire distributorship, he has pursued a host of activities that he discussed with us in our second visit with him in March of 1993 at his office in Gardena, California.
I've got the Shelby Can-Am for young race drivers, $35,000 car. You can race the season for probably $100,000. And counting the car, the tow car, the whole thing, which is, it's the cheapest form of racing that you can prove your competence as a race driver or your abilities that there is. And I think the cost of racing is ridiculous, and I think that if these sanctioning bodies don't really get off their duff and do something about it, they don't know how close they are to being out of business.
The Shelby Can-Am cars, seen here racing at Road Atlanta, have taken the spec racer concept, made popular by the Sports Renault series, to the next logical step. Until Michael Andretti's Formula One debut in 1993, there had been no contending drivers on the Grand Prix circuit in almost 20 years. And with the costs involved in fielding a successful Indianapolis 500 team, young drivers have limited opportunities to break into that style of racing. The Shelby Can-Am, a car that can reach speeds of close to 140 miles per hour, is built at Shelby's Gardena facility, where the tubular frames are hand-constructed one at a time. Since spec racers are not allowed to undergo any modifications to enhance speed or handling, all Can-Ams leave the Shelby factory in identical condition, shipped on pallets to the customers, who then assemble the cars themselves. The Shelby Can-Am series has survived some early controversies to become a popular support race at many major league racing events. It's the kind of race car that one might expect Carroll Shelby to build. A man who has always believed in American superiority, and a successful entrepreneur who easily identifies with the everyday racer who wants to go fast without going broke.
What we're trying to do is put into effect the axiom as it should be. The guy that's the best should win the race. The guy that prepares his car the best. The guy that's the best driver. Not some SOB whose father gives him $100,000 to go out and beat the little guys that never had a chance to beat him in the first place. I feel that it is the epitome of what a spec car should be. It may not be the most sophisticated racing car in the world, but it'll be the same 5 years from now as it is today, and it'll permit the young drivers a chance that may never ever get a chance to move up into the top echelon of racing. This is the most powerful spec car that's been built. 250 to 300 horsepower. Most of the other spec cars have been 150, 160 horsepower at the most. And this will give the drivers that we haven't seen get a chance to move up into an area where we can see if they can really go on to greatness. Dodge is been very inspiring in the whole thing. They backed us all the way. We have the new 3.3-liter engine, which will be a showcase for that engine, and we're looking to a long and fruitful relationship with them because we'll move on to the Pro Series with a Dodge engine also, hopefully.
Of course, this car has galvanized the Shelby Dodge Association with explosive impact. The Dodge Viper, the V10-powered sports car that has become the modern-day equivalent of the legendary 427 Cobra. In our 1990 interview with Shelby, before the Viper went into production, he was already showing boundless enthusiasm for a car that he helped to conceive.
It's a hell of an automobile. I'm tickled to death with it. The guys have done a terrific job of putting it together. It's going to be just about what the 427 Cobra was 30 years ago. It's still going to be a wind-in-the-face sport car, but it's got some improvements. Suspension, brakes, a few more of the creature comforts, but I am very, very happy to be associated with it, and I'm looking forward to doing a lot of test driving in it the next year while we're getting into production. It rides good, yet it goes around a skid pad 1.3 all day long. We'll do even better, and it's just a hell of a lot of fun to drive. I don't think that we're looking for the fastest sport car in the world in the terms of Lamborghini, Countach, these 200-mile-an-hour sport cars. Hell, nobody ever drives at 200 miles an hour. I think that what we're trying to build is something that goes 0 to 100 to 0. You can put a couple of small suitcases in, something that the guy can work on himself, doesn't have to be an electronic genius, and I think that we've accomplished all the parameters that we laid out 2 years ago, and we're going to be producing the car within 3 years from the time we sat around in Bob Lutz's office and came up with a concept.
This is the incredible Chrysler Technology Center in Highland Park, Michigan, where the Viper team first laid plans for the incredible Roadster. And this exclusive footage was shot at Chrysler's new Mack assembly facility in Detroit, where Vipers are constructed. There are no automated assembly lines here, and dozens of Vipers are not rolling out of the building each day. These cars are built slowly by hand, and the assembly crew assigned to the Viper project were individually selected based on their personal interests in volunteering for the project. Each Viper that is built at Numac is tested on a dynamometer once the powertrain has been installed in the car. The Viper is a car that is produced with a sharp focus on performance. In our 1993 interview with Shelby, he spoke again of his involvement with the Viper project.
We've got the first Viper behind us. I didn't contribute a hell of a lot into the design of it, except the Cobra was the spirit of it. That's when I was waiting for my new heart, and the guys were at Chrysler, were Bob Lutz especially, was kind enough to make me a part of the four-man team, since the Cobra was the kind of the spiritual father of the Viper.
And as part of the pilot team that Chrysler assembled to coordinate design and construction of the Viper, Carroll Shelby's ideas and insights into what makes a great sports car can clearly be seen in the finished product. Its styling is drop-dead gorgeous, and with its 8-liter V10 making 400 horsepower and 450 foot-pounds of torque, the Viper can back up its aggressive looks with astounding performance. And the Viper features none of the high-tech mechanical wizardry you'll find on most other exotics. No turbos, no ABS, no adjustable suspension, and no all-wheel drive. And perhaps one of Shelby's most rewarding moments came in 1991, when he was asked to drive the Viper pace car that led the field at the Indianapolis 500.
Oh, it was a lot of fun. The year before, I was laying in the hospital with tubes in practically every vein, and a year later to go back there and drive thousands of miles taking people riding in the new Viper, I can't tell you how excited I was and how much I enjoyed it. Not only just being alive, but driving that new car and being so much a part of it. I thank Bob Lutz for doing that for me.
This is the Viper GTS, a closed coupe version of the open roadster Viper. The GTS caused spectacular shockwaves through the automotive world when first shown by Chrysler in early 1993. It is an obvious derivative of Carroll Shelby's world champion 1965 Cobra Daytona coupes. The fastback profile and wide Le Mans stripes down the center of the car are vivid reminders of the cars which captured the world's sports car spotlight in the golden age of GT racing.
It's a lot of Daytona coupe and GTO Ferrari, and they're going to build it now, I'm told. And I'm very glad, because we do need a car with roll-up windows in the top. Some of the climates, like the old Cobras, you know, with no roll-up windows, they're very limited, especially in a hailstorm. And I'm glad that Bob Lutz has put the crew together and decided to build a coupe.
We asked Shelby if he knew how Pete Brock, the designer of the Daytona coupe, had reacted when he first saw the Viper GTS.
Pete was very influential in the design of the Cobra, Daytona Cobra coupe, as you know, so it's a real compliment to Pete and his abilities. He's happy about it. He's doing a book on the coupes, by the way, now, so listen to this, look for Pete's new book that's coming out on the Daytona coupes that we built at Shelby.
Palm Springs, California, where the annual historic races bring the great race cars of yesterday back into the limelight. In 1990, the cars of Shelby American were the featured mark at the Palm Springs event, and it gave us a golden opportunity to see Shelby automobiles turning back the clock and attacking this road course with the kind of relentless ferocity that has always distinguished these high-performance animals. These Cobras and Shelby Mustangs are owned for the most part by members of the Shelby American Automobile Club, and their universal devotion to driving these cars in the manner in which they were intended is quite an experience. Some of the cars attending this Shelby reunion were literally priceless, especially the 427 Cobras, which were restored to breathtaking perfection. With just a shade under 350 big block Cobras ever produced, you might think that their current market values would discourage anyone from running these massively powerful sports cars on a racetrack. But these owners get much more satisfaction out of enjoying the performance of these great cars than just watching their appreciation. It's a ringing tribute to Carroll Shelby that these Cobra and Shelby Mustang owners continue to compete with their cars 3 decades after they were first built. Shelby has long maintained that his cars were never intended to be boulevard cruisers or pampered garage curios. Carroll Shelby gets as much of a thrill out of seeing his cars thrown around a racetrack as the drivers who do, regardless of how much these cars are worth. And the values of these cars have led to an incredible growth industry in the last 10 years, an industry that has helped to perpetuate the Shelby mystique. Known as Cobra replicas or kit cars, there are now dozens of companies worldwide producing their own interpretations of the Cobra, either in kit or turnkey versions. This is an ERA 427 SC, a Cobra replica that, in the minds of many, is the most faithful and skillfully engineered Cobra reproduction on the market. ERA's headquarters in New Britain, Connecticut, has gained a tremendous reputation for the cars they manufacture. And Vice President of Marketing, Peter Portante, told us what has motivated the thousands of Cobra replica owners into buying and building them.
I think the basic profile is a hard worker who wants a Cobra, who always missed the real one. He was always a couple steps away and was able to finally decide, I'm never going to get a real one. They're just too much money. I'll build a replica.
Of all the component cars sold not only in America but worldwide, the Cobra is far and away the most popular car being replicated anywhere. Which brings us full circle to another venture which Carroll Shelby has undertaken. In this shop at his Gardena headquarters, 427 SC Cobras are being built. It's a story laced heavily with mystery, intrigue, and controversy, which is exactly what you might expect from one of America's few remaining pioneers. We asked Shelby to talk about his amazing resurrection of history's most intimidating muscle car and some of the controversy surrounding it.
I've got 43 Cobras that I never sold because you couldn't get $10,000 a piece for them back in 1965. And I am completing them. I'm restoring them. I will never, ever sell all of them, but we had a young man that bought old AC cars in England, and he decided to convince the world that AC designed and was the manufacturer of the cars, when the truth of the matter that Shelby American was the manufacturer and sold all the cars. They were all registered and MSO'd by Shelby American, and I just decided that since there's so many replica cars out there, and this guy was trying to change history, that I would complete these cars and renew them and restore them, and I sell 1 or 2 a year, but I don't want to sell enough of them that I affect the price of the other 57 427 Cobra SCs that are out there. But I wanted to build them as they should have been built in the first place. They weren't built right properly because of the technology of the mid-60s, the metallurgy and so forth, and so I've redone the tooling in aircraft quality stuff, and that's not a real high priority of mine, but it's something that I wanted the world to recognize, the fact that the Ken Miles and the Phil Remingtons and the Lou Spencers and the Al Dowds that made the Cobra what it was and won the world championship. It damn sure wasn't AC cars. They didn't have anything to do with it except waiting for a check every day. Every month, and building my chassis for us. And I get kind of upset when they call it an AC Cobra. That wasn't even the name of the car. The name of the car was a Shelby Cobra. And you can understand the English wanting to take a little credit for it, but they got paid for what they did. It'd be like calling a Ferrari by whoever, Farina or whoever built the bodies. And I'd like to see the car call what its name was. It was a Shelby Cobra. That's the way it was registered. That's the way the FIA awarded the world championship. They awarded it to the Shelby Cobra, not to the AC Cobra. And I just thought that I'd stir them up a little bit and show them that I could build a car like it should have been built in the first place.
Shelby's new generation 427 SC Cobras are priced at $500,000 apiece. Of that, Shelby only takes out the expenses necessary to build the car, while the profits go directly to an organization that he created shortly after his heart transplant, the Shelby Heart Fund.
It's for indigent children that need heart transplants, need medication for heart problems. I only help indigent children because they never get a chance. It's always somebody with the money and the political connections, it seems like, that can afford transplants and the very expensive cardiac surgery. So I want my money to go to the kids.
Carroll Shelby's life proves conclusively that there are still true American heroes. There have been countless accomplishments in his life, and even after impacting the automotive universe for over 30 years, you can't help but feel that he has more surprises waiting for us. His reputation as a charming rogue who could inspire loyalty in others and convince anyone of the unconvincible may be the qualities he'll long be remembered for, along with his stunning victories on the world's most famous racetracks. But it's impossible to discount the remarkable luck and astonishing good fortune that have always seemed to guide the steps of this smiling Texan. There may be more than just blind coincidence that the heart that Carroll Shelby received during his heart transplant in 1990 came from a 34-year-old gambler who collapsed and died in a Las Vegas casino while at the tables. Carroll Shelby, 3 decades of speed and still an American original.